And as we go through this particular piece of work, Jade and I are going to kind of swap around and talk differently about all of the things. So over to you, Jade. Jade will have to tell me when to change the slides. Sometimes that means I've got to pay close attention. I'll probably have some funny little beeps or something, Jade. Okay.
Not a problem. Okay, so we're having a look at the standard, which is how natural processes work to shape the environment. And when we look at the standard on the next slide, we can see that it says demonstrate understanding how natural processes shape an environment. So paying attention to the word processes and noting that it is a plural is very important for success with the standard. And we're going from demonstrating understanding to explaining how natural processes shape environments through to examining. Now, on the next slide, we're going to have a look a little bit more closely at the achieved merit and excellence criteria as outlined in explanatory note 1. So you can see...
Sorry.
That's all right. Just down one, please.
I've just deleted something. Just hold on a moment. I've just deleted the slides.
So we can see at the achieved level we're describing, and so we're really looking at natural processes and the phenomena, the impacts that result from the processes and the phenomena, and then your use of relevant evidence and terminology. Now, when we move into merit, that descriptor moves to explain, but there's also another couple of changes. So again, explain how the processes, plural, create phenomena in the environment. And then it talks about explaining wider impacts of the processes on the environment. There's no mention of phenomena in this criteria. When we look at the excellence criteria, we start to ask students to examine, like we do in all of our standards, and they have to be able to examine and explain the implications of the processes for the environment, and then really integrate and comprehensively use that terminology and evidence to develop their explanation and show they've got some insight into what is going on. The next slide is some more explanatory notes that I think are pretty important for us to pay attention to. So the standard talks about shaping an environment. So an environment being a particular geographic area with its own characteristics. And it's really important to note that they do consider people to be part of the environment. And so while this is a really physical-based geography standard, people do come up within it, and we'll talk a bit more about that. So ideally, you need to have a case study, so a beach, a river, a plane, anything like that. If it's somewhere in your local area or somewhere accessible to take ākonga on a trip, that is even better, so they can become really familiar with this environment and the processes that are going on there, what the phenomena look like, and who the people are that might be impacted by those processes. Now, explanatory note 3 covers what natural processes are. So you've got 5, and we suggest that across your teaching and learning program, your students have experience and exposure to all of these processes. So you might choose a case study like the Mount Taranaki Maunga, and so we've got tectonic processes and volcanism, and some glaciation there, but also some fluvial processes. So you want to pick a case study that has at least 2 processes operating in it, and then you're going to give your students a bit more of a general overview of the processes and phenomena that exist in the other types of environments. So explanatory note 4 talks about phenomena being geographic features or objects or events that can be mapped, and sometimes we might call these landforms. So anything that's created by a natural process, and again, there's lots and lots of them. If we think about the 5 natural processes, glacial, tectonic, climatic, coastal, and fluvial, there's quite a number of phenomena. So we are suggesting your students have an overview of the key phenomena created by natural processes, and key phenomena that we would say are foundational geography and suitable for level 1 students. And Mary is going to go over what we consider to be suitable phenomena a little bit later in the slideshow. The next slide, explanatory note 5, talks about implications. So as I mentioned before, people are considered part of Te Taiao, and when we're looking at implications, we're looking at the implications, real or potential effects or outcomes for people who live in or near the environments that you are studying. So impacts, it's like a direct impact on the environment. So you might have muddying of a river mouth, which occurs due to the natural process of erosion in the surrounding hills. So the wider impact is thinking a little bit more broadly and thinking, well, how does that direct impact affect something else? So we could say that the muddying of the river mouth because of the erosion, then the wider impact is on the river's ecosystem and all the creatures and plant life that live there. And then when we think about implications, we're thinking about those real or potential effects or outcomes for people. So if we've had muddying of the river mouth, which has then gone on to have a wider impact on the ecosystem, what does that then do to people? How might they be affected? So we're thinking of that sort of chain of events. And so what it could mean is that people can't go and fish in that local hour or in that local in this case, in an hour. And so then community fishing events have to move, or maybe traditional food gathering, Kaimoana grounds, can't be accessed. So you're really having to think a little bit further and think, okay, how might this affect people in the future? Now, the next slide talks about the assessment. Now, is this you or me, Mary? I can't remember.
Your name written on it.
I can't. Oh, I can just see that. Right. So two sections, and we've had lots of questions about this. So section 1 is sort of your unfamiliar section. It's not going to be related to your case study. And it is the area where your students need to apply the knowledge they have about these broad range of natural processes to a question. So there's going to be 3 questions, and your students choose one. Now, each question will be set in a different type of geographic environment that have been formed by different natural processes. So you could have a geographic environment that's formed by tectonic, glacial and fluvial processes. You might have one environment that might be coastal and fluvial. You might have one that's, fluvial, tectonic and climatic. It doesn't matter which question your students choose to answer, because from our understanding, the questions are all the same. It's just the environment and the processes that are working there that are different. So your students need to choose the one that they feel most comfortable with. And they're going to demonstrate an understanding about how the natural processes work within that environment, how they might create phenomena, and the implications that they might have for the people who live there. And then in section 2, it's written answers about your case study environment. So this is where we're looking for students to demonstrate their knowledge and specific understanding about the place you have studied, the environment you have studied, and the processes that are operating to shape that environment. Now, it does say in the assessment spec, written answers, and support the answers with annotated maps and or diagrams. So there is that expectation that a really solid answer will have diagrams or annotations and maps that the student refers to support what they're saying. Now, Christina, I think there's a question you have just said, do they have to choose different processes in section 1 to their case study? No, they can answer on whichever environment they want. If there's an environment that comes up that has the same processes as the one you have learned as a case study, they are welcome to extrapolate, what they know and apply it to section 1 as well. So Mary's going to talk you through what we think section 1 could look like. And we sort of do our thinking based on the sample exam.
So what we have done now is we're going to look at the sorts of things that might appear in the sample assessment. And we've sent you links to those assessments. So here, for example, is that there's going to be 3 different geographic environments, maybe a photograph or 2, and maybe a map of some sort, perhaps a little like this. So this is from Oniroa Bay in the Bay of Islands, or in Kororareka, and this is Long Beach. So the students might get a topographic map. Obviously, unlike my example, they'd have a scale and eastings and northings and a north point, you know, all the things. And then I've put here a couple of photographs. And students will be asked to do something with this data. So they might be asked to show, for example, oh, I've skipped a page, hold on. So students might be asked to label some different processes that might be occurring on the photograph or map. So for example, on here, I might have been able to locate some longshore drift along the beach, or perhaps there might be weathering on the headland, or maybe there's coastal erosion of the dunes. They might annotate them to show how the process might be working, or they might have to write a paragraph to explain how those processes are shaping in a very general way, and we'll touch on that in a moment. So whilst the students might know nothing about this particular beach, they hopefully will have enough detail to be able to guess that there might be some weathering happening here. Or they might be able to say that there's some cliff erosion happening here. Another thing they might be asked to do is to label some different phenomena that they see on the photograph or map and suggest how they're created. So they might have a dune or a beach or a headland, and there might be some questions about how were those particular phenomena created, because you'll remember back in the standard that is part of how have natural processes created particular phenomena. This is you, Jade.
Oh, you can carry on. Or they may be asked to suggest some of the impacts or implications that the natural processes might have on the environment. So in this instance, if we had increased erosion at the top of the beach, it might affect the road that runs along the top of the beach there. Or it might, if you had some type of climatic event going on up in those hills, you might get some erosion, you might have limited access onto that road. So thinking about the people as well as the wider environment.
And for some reason, this is now me. So this is the questions that were asked using the sample assessment, and then we're applying the Oniroa unseen environment to this. So name 2 processes that would have operated to shape this environment. Let's just say 2 processes. One would be coastal and the second one might be climatic. And we've labeled the topographic map and photo to show a range of different features. And then we might be able to explain how 2 of those features you labeled were formed by those processes. So for example, we've got a beach, a sand dunes, and a bay. So what the students would do is to describe the sequence of events involved in the process to form those. So if this were me, I would choose the sand dunes, and I would be able to write about and explain about how did those sand dunes form in a very generic-y kind of way, if I can. But it does say include case study evidence and geographic terminology. So for example, and I'll just skip back to this. So for example, if we were talking about coastal erosion, we might have, this is north here, by the way, we might say that there might be coastal erosion along the beach, has happened, and then they would be having to refer to maybe this road or maybe these rocky outcrops or something like that, so they can use the information that they can see from the topo map and the beach itself, and the photograph in this case. So the key thing that's really important is this idea of sequence of events, and the students need to be able to describe that sequence of events. Other ways they could ask are, Jade?
And just following on from what you were saying there, I think this need to be pulling and extrapolating detail out of topo maps or photos really reinforces this idea that we need to be teaching skills throughout all our units of work. So it's really important for this standard. It's really important, we know, for the geographic challenge standard. So do make sure your students are having lots of exposure to interpreting different types of sources. So they might also be asked to explain how a natural process could shape the environment, or what are some of the impacts or wider impacts of a natural process on the environment, or how might a natural process have a long-term implication for the environment. So we're not asking them to know all about that place and what is going on, but to consider, okay, what do I know about coastal processes? What do I know about where coastal erosion would occur the most? Which types of areas would be the most vulnerable? What do I know about how beaches are formed? And be able to articulate that. There is a question in the chat. So when it says case study information, it means specific evidence from the resource, not case study evidence from the actual case study. Yeah, that's correct. And maybe that is a bit of a funny wording in the sample paper, because we know that part A, or question 1, is not about their case study.
One of the things, just as a little aside, so the Board of Geography teachers will have available to you a little later in the term 2 samples of exams for 1.3. Incidentally, we'll also have 2 samples for 1.4. That will be available for you to use as a derived grade exam. But we thought we'd provide 2 so you had an opportunity to work through one of them with your students in a kind of a teaching and learning kind of environment, so they can get a really good, feel really comfortable going into the exam. All right. Sorry.
Just one more thing. I think this is where you've got to be careful too. If your students do answer about the same processes and same type of environment in section A as in section B, they need to be really careful that they're just answering the question that is being asked about the unfamiliar environment, because if they start writing all about their specific case study, that's going to be problematic, because you're being asked about the place shown in the resource, not your place. So that's just a little trick, I suppose, that you want to make sure you're being very clear with your students to watch out for that trap for young players.
Alrighty. Now the NZQA have put online and of an exemplar examination at excellence level, and we're just going to pull out a couple of bits to show you the kinds of things that are in the exemplar examination. If you can only see it in its redacted version, you just need to log into NZQA using your ESL, and you should be able to locate this. If you can't locate the actual pictures and the actual topographic map, and you don't have an ESL, go to your PN and they should be able to do this. So here's what the students had to do. They had to label some features, sand dunes and floodplain. And then they were asked to name 2 processes, and in this case they've got longshore drift and fluvial, and then they had to explain how 2 of the features, and I'm just going to talk briefly about one of these. I've labelled the spit on the map provided. this has been caused by longshore drift, the prevailing wind, blah, blah, blah. You can read that. Causes waves to approach the beach at an angle. When the waves hit the beach, they move the same angle, blah, 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 blah. So this is kind of showing the kind of process, that sequence of events that happens to form a spit. So they've got a general overview, but there's no detail about what kind of sand it is or what angle exactly it is at. But that's the kind of thing that a student might have to do for this part A part of the question. There aren't any specifics, but it did say to use case study evidence. So maybe in this case, it might say, as the spit is running in a XY direction, whatever that is, they might be able to then bring something like that in. So that would be worthwhile encouraging.
So that probably seems like quite a lot. It's quite a lot to get your head around, and we really appreciate that it is quite a change from this assessment last year, and that 5 natural processes, that's a very broad scope of teaching which your students will need to cover. And like you've just said, isn't that way too complex for level 1? Yeah, it is a lot. So we really will be encouraging teachers, and we are encouraging teachers to keep it at a foundational level. So you've got breadth, but we're not going into depth. So a lot of teaching through sequencing diagrams, looking at maps, looking at photographs, looking at different places around the world where we can make some comparisons and show that, you know, this process is happening here and it's exactly the same here. Are there any questions? Oh, this is a digital exam. Sorry, a paper exam. I just read the word digital. No, it is a paper exam. And so we can definitely have our students going in there with our coloured pens and pencils so they can draw those awesome diagrams.
And just as an aside, remember also that 1.4 is also a paper handwritten exam unless students have special conditions.
Yeah. So the next couple of sections of the slides are about how you might get your students to become familiar with these processes at a more foundational level, I suppose. 2 different approaches. Do you want to talk about this, Mary?
Yeah, so I'm going to now talk about one way you could do this. So we've identified really 2 different ways you could tackle this, lots of stuff with our students. Remember, as Jade said, it's about foundational learning for students, but also remember, in the whole big scheme of things, we want students to be really great geographers. So we want them to go on holiday with their families or when they're older and drive down a road and go, oh, I'm driving along a river valley, or oh, there's a moraine, or whatever it is that they can see. So it's helping them to become really good geographers. So here's one approach. So I'm going to talk about a quite a traditional way that you could tackle this with your students. So one way would be to have a series of overview lessons on the different natural processes that your case study doesn't cover. And you might spend 3 or 4 weeks, maybe with your students, overviewing those particular natural processes. So a week on glaciers and a week on tectonics and a week on climate processes, say, for example, then explicitly teach your case study. So that's the kind of traditional way that you might do this. So what it might look like a range of resources. So you might have some topics that you cover. So we've developed a series of PowerPoints that overview the 5 natural processes. So we've got things, we cover the natural processes, common phenomena, photographs, topographic maps, implications, and sometimes we've incorporated some geographic challenges in for you. So before I talk about those, in a sense, we spent some time kind of thinking about, if we were looking at this, what if we were thinking about fluvial processes, what are some of the big picture phenomena? Well, obviously a meander, an oxbow lake, a waterfall, a floodplain, maybe a delta, maybe those are the phenomena. And you can see the sorts of things that are kind of key things that you might the phenomena that students might use. So you aren't going to necessarily be wanting to really identify all of the different phenomena that you can see, say, in a river or something like that. So I'm going to show you now some sample bits and pieces from one of the resources that we've developed. So we've developed a resource on fluvial processes, coastal processes, glacial, climatic, and tectonic. And I've covered kind of all of these questions within them. The resources have been developed as here's what we think would be the right kind of thing. They're not really PowerPoints to show you your students particularly. They're being presented in PowerPoint format, but they are kind of for you to use and with your students in some way, but with some maybe other activities within them. So I'm going to show you some from our glacier processes PowerPoint. So we have a bit of an overview. What is a glacier? So students know what a glacier is. They have some information about how do glaciers form, and we would probably be focusing on these kinds of glaciers. We've got some information about, let's look at some famous glaciers across the globe. This one could be particularly interesting to look at in the Kashmir region, given what's going on in the world right now. Here's information about how a glacier forms. So you can see here, they are really simple. So this is a great thing for students to be drawing diagrams, snow building up over these things. So building kind of on that to create and show how a glacier might be formed. We have identified maybe some examples of different type of phenomena that glacial movement creates. We have some examples of phenomena and what they look like on a topographic map and also in photographs. So students can see, if I see a topographic map looking like this and the contour lines are like this and like this, that might suggest whatever's happening. We have like a photograph, and so you can see kind of, you could use something like this to show what's going on in the Fiordland. There's some information about what a moraine is and how it was formed. So we've put a whole lot of bits and pieces in there to help you really kind of think about, well, what is it that students will need to kind of know about this? Remember, this might take a week if you weren't doing glaciation, for example. Here's what it might look like on a topographic map. Here's what it might look like on a photograph. Maybe how do glacial processes impact the environment? So this is looking at the second part, if you like, the impacts. And here's some ways that glacial processes impact the environment. And then, because when I was putting this one together, I was thinking about, well, let's have a think about how could this be, how could a glacial environment, we could think about if this is a geographic challenge, and you might delve into looking at some kinds of things. So this is a couple of photographs of some glaciers and how they've changed over time. Sorry, this is a painting, and this is the same place over time and how that's changed. And then you have finish off by looking at the idea that if you've got slow ice loss, you might attempt to reduce the ice loss by putting blankets over the glaciers, which is what they've done in the Rhone Glacier, to help protect the glaciers over time. So we've produced a series of resources about all of the different processes and phenomena that happen, and they're all sitting on the Board of Geography teachers page. There's a a little section that just under 1.3, that's all about unseen. So you can find all of those resources there for students. Oh, for you rather, beg pardon, not for students.
And I think there's lots of activities available in textbooks and online that are pitched at helping students make sense of this type of information. So you don't need to reinvent the wheel and create all the activities to do with all of the natural processes. Do go and look, and because there's lots already created in regards to sort of teaching physical geography. Now, what I'm going to talk about is a very non-traditional approach to how you might teach natural processes. So this sort of completely turns the traditional approach on its head, I suppose, and it might appeal to some of you. So I thought you could develop units of work that use big ideas and multiple pieces of significant learning as a key way to teach your students. So we talk about assessment falling out, but it is still done in quite an intentional way. So rather than teaching 1.3 for 6 or 7 weeks, you might do it this way, and you might take a place-based focus. And you would have to do this across a number of units of work. I don't think you could do it by just teaching one unit that had a place-based focus. So I thought about it, and I thought Mary and I had quite a few discussions that if you had a place-based unit and you picked some places in Aotearoa and somewhere sort of similar, somewhere globally, what you could do was integrate different pieces of significant learning all based around that place. So if you looked at Hanmer Springs and say the Swiss Alps, for example, you might talk about natural processes, and you might look at tectonics and glaciation and climatic processes, and if you're in Hanmer, some fluvial processes as well. But within that unit, you might also touch upon ideas of spatial distribution and tourism and power generation and geographic challenges. So it's quite a holistic approach to teaching. The next slide has another example. So you might look at somewhere like the Gold Coast and Mount Maunganui and use that to teach about coastal and climatic processes. Both those places also have some tectonic processes in the way of volcanism. And you might also look at things like migration and how that applies and is relevant to both places. Again, you could look at spatial distribution and look at different things to do with tourism and its impacts. You could look at natural events and how they have impacted those places. And the final one here, I'm thinking you might look at somewhere like Tongariro National Park or Aoraki, and then you might also look at somewhere like Hawaii or the Mount Vesuvius sort of region, the Bay of Naples, and you may look at tectonics through that lens, but you also might look at human use of those areas and geothermal power. You might look at different geographic challenges. You could look at spatial distribution of volcanoes. So it is a really different way of doing things, but I think it would be a really engaging way to teach your students, and they would walk away from your course knowing lots of geography about different places. Now, on the BOGT website, we have developed this unit called People, River and Places, focused on the Nile as a place. And what the idea was is that this unit of work shows you how to integrate different pieces of significant learning from our learning matrix and how you can teach sort of demography and population studies and fluvial processes all together using Egypt as a context and then bringing in some different places like China. So some of the thoughts and this has just got some of the activities and some of the ideas shown in the next couple of slides. And if you want to know more, this full resource and full unit is on the BOGT page. Can you just flip that slide, Mary?
Yeah, sure. I'll just say it's under population or demography section, but it's also under the 1.3 page as well. So the link to that, plus all the resources for this unit.
Yeah. So to sort of combine and marry demography and fluvial processes and set the scene to help students understand how this unit of work actually works together, you could look at early human settlement around the Euphrates and think about why civilization grew there, and then sort of have a look at some of the physical and natural factors that influence where people live. And then in the next slide, it shows a zoom in to look at population distribution within Egypt. I love that satellite image. It clearly shows the influence of the Nile River on where people live. And you could look at historic and current distributions. And then once you've done that, going into fluvial processes, using this place as a context, but without expecting students to know all the ins and outs as a case study. But if you're going to talk about the drainage basin, you could do it using a map of the Nile drainage basin to give them some context so they understand, what is the watershed, what are tributaries, what's a confluence, and start to look at it within the Egyptian context. You could do the same thing when you looked at the different courses of the river within the drainage basin. Looking in the upper course on the next slide, there's a lesson about waterfall formation. So they're not expected to know all about the Blue Nile waterfalls, but it uses that as an example. And then the next two slides show you an activity that's found within this unit about how might you teach students at a foundational level as to how waterfalls are formed. And I think the next slide has the answers and a bit of a gap fill. So you'd find all these resources in the unit of work. Then moving down to the lower course, looking at floodplains. How are they formed? Why are they important in the Nile? Looking at the Nile River Delta. How's that formed? What's the difference between a delta and an estuary? So again, they don't need to know the ins and outs of the Nile River Delta, but they understand the processes and can sort of see that in action within this place. So like Mary said, it is on the website, and while not fully resourced, there are a lot of resources to support the teaching and learning within that unit of work.
So we've come to the end of our presentation, really, and now it's time for some questions. So whilst we've been doing that presentation, I've seen that there's been lots of questions that have come up. And yes, this is a lot. Remember, though, it's foundational. So we're about foundational geography. We're not about lots and lots and lots of information. They don't have to know all about the Nile River and its tributaries and how was the how were the waterfalls formed or that sort of thing. It's probably best to have that kind of keep in your mind that it's foundational. So if you were doing the way I talked about it, you might be spending a week on fluvial if that wasn't your case study, a week on something else and a week on something else. Or if you're doing it the way Jade is doing it, or has talked about, we would have, maybe that might have been a term's worth of work. And then there was maybe something else, another topic where you're covering something else. And yeah, so we do acknowledge that this is a lot. And just for someone who said, will the PowerPoint be shared to us? Yes, it will. But we'll actually send it to you once we've finished all our presentations. And I'm actually going to stop recording now.